It's a prayer. It's a prayer for people that oftentimes lost hope that the mountain would move. So they didn't pray for it. They prayed for strength and the ability to climb and the ability to move around. And they prayed for the hearts of those who had built the mountain that prevented them from the promise. It's amazing. As it is in life. Separate but equal have been upheld 7 times by the Supreme Court. Every time it was argued that there was inequality, and the court ruled, fix the inequality. The standard stays. Separate can be equal. But in 1954, the Supreme Court took a case about school desegregation. Brown versus Board of Education. And the Supreme Court looked away from precedent, looked away from legal arguments, and looked towards the humanity of black children. And they said the obvious: segregation harms them. They said separate facilities are inherently unequal and unconstitutional and have no place in our Constitution. Segregation had to come down. It was a huge break in that barricade. But the next year they kind of closed it up a little. When they ruled in a separate ruling, the segregation had to be dismantled and integration had to happen with, quote, all deliberate speed. A synonym for deliberate is slow. But Rosa Parks wasn't about to wait. December 1st, 1955, Montgomery buses were still segregated. And Rosa Parks is seated in no man's land. Let me explain. On a given bus, there's the front, the first 14 seats. They are reserved for whites. The back, there are 14 more, and that's where blacks were to sit. In between was no man's land. And you could sit there if you were black, but if asked, you were to vacate. And it was the bus driver that had discretion. Well, on December 1st, Rosa Parks is in the first row, behind a full white section. She's in the first row of no man's land. Everything else is filled as well. A white passenger gets on, makes the request. 3 in that row of 4 immediately leave, but Rosa Parks does not. The bus driver comes back and says, "You make light of yourself and move." She says, "I don't think I should have to." She stayed. Well, she was arrested. And then she, in addition to being a department store worker, she was an NAACP worker. And immediately, the office of the NAACP was called, and a man named Edie Nixon went down and paid her bond and brought her home. And he talked to her, and he was telling her and her family, "You're the right person. We can challenge this law with you." And her husband's going, "The white folks are going to kill you, Rosa. Don't." But she said, "I'm going to. Could it help Montgomery? Could it help our community? I'll go." So she decides to. And that's only the beginning of the story. I'm going to go through it fast because of time. Please try to follow. Edie Nixon goes, and it's probably about 7 or 8 o'clock now, and he immediately calls the Women's Political Action Committee of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. They go into action. Women always do. And they hit this office at about 12 midnight. Now, this is a Thursday, December 1st. And what they do is they immediately draft up a letter of protest, create a leaflet that calls for a boycott, and they mimeograph 35,000 copies. They finish at 6 a.m. as the sun is coming up. They worked all night. They did not sleep. Edie Nixon had gotten up at 5 a.m. and called all the ministers and pastors of the town to tell their congregation what was about to occur, and that it would take place on Monday. And then he asked one minister if they could use his basement at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And a 26-year-old minister named Martin Luther King Jr. said yes. The boycott would be Monday, and the mass meeting would be at 7. Now, the Monday boycott was a complete success. And all the black ministers met at 5 to consider what's next. No blacks rode on the buses at all. It worked. But do we go forward? And that's what these leaders, these African-American leaders in the town of Montgomery, and the ministers being primary among them, met to discuss. And E.D. Nixon wanted to continue the boycott. But the ministers were going, but you can't publish my name. Okay, I'm all right with that, but gee, you really can't. And he unloaded on them. He said, you guys have got to stop hiding behind the women. Take off your aprons. You have to be men and stop being little boys and cowards. And in the middle of this tirade, Martin Luther King Jr., who was late, give him a break, he just had a 2-year-old, or a 2-month-old. He was late, and just at that moment he wakes in and says, quote, "Calmly, Brother Nixon, I am not a coward. I don't want anyone to call me a coward." It stopped the tirade. He invited Mr. King to speak some more. Mr. King argued that the bus boycott should continue and that everybody should put their name on the line. And that's what he supports. And it turned the argument. And the decision was made. The Montgomery Improvement Association was formed. And the 26-year-old minister, who had been in town for about a year, was chosen its president. And now it's about 6 o'clock, 6:05, 6:10, and they inform him, by the way, as president, you have to speak at the 7 o'clock meeting. He said yes. He rushes home, and Coretta, his wife, is there, and she's fixing dinner, taking care of the 2-month-old. And he tells her, honey, I was elected president. And he asked her, is that okay with you? She says, yes, if it's okay with you, it's okay with me. She offers him dinner. He says, no, I don't have time. I've got to go in and work out what I'm going to say. And he goes into a room by himself, and he scribbles down some notes. And about 20 minutes later, he comes out and gets in a car that drives into the Holt Street Baptist Church where the meeting will take place. Fortunately, there was a little bit of a traffic jam because there were so many people at the church, fortunately because it gives me more time. So many people in the church that they couldn't fit in the church. The church was full, but there was overflow onto the yard and the grounds all around. They were putting up speakers on the outside of the church so people outside could hear. Just imagine that this room is full, we put up speakers, and the entire front yard was full of people. And Dr. King was walking into that, having no more than a half hour to prepare. He's going to make his first civil rights speech. He said, he asked himself, what could I say to keep them courageous, prepared for positive action, and yet devoid of hate and resentment? Let's see if he accomplished his goal. First of all, to keep them devoid of hate and resentment, he started the speech with love. Love of America and love of democracy. In his first paragraph, he says, we are here because we are American citizens, and we are determined to apply our citizenship to the fullness of its meaning. We are here because of our love for democracy. Listen to this now. Because of our deep-seated belief that democracy, transformed from thin paper to thick action, is the greatest form of government on earth. Now, to keep them courageous, he used poetry and preaching. Vince one time in a message defined courage as, I use the word encourage, to pour courage in. Well, Dr. King poured courage into his audience with poetry and preaching. Here's the poetry. He said clauses like, and you know, my friend, there comes a time when people get tired of being trampled over by the iron feet of oppression. There comes a time when people get tired of being pushed out of the glittering sunlight of life's July and left standing amid the piercing chill of an alpine November. And preaching. And we are not wrong. We are not wrong in what we are doing here. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, justice is a lie, and love has no meaning. And we are determined to work and fight until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. And in every sentence, it is being interrupted by yells and screams cheers so loud that as they die down in the church, they build on the yard. And then he finishes with how to compare them to positive action. I want to say that we are not here advocating violence. We have never done that. We are a Christian people. We believe in the teachings of Jesus. The only weapon that we have in our hand this evening is the weapon of protest. That's all. He was a 26-year-old man. Think of yourself, 26. He had 30 minutes to prepare. The greatness of that speech is hard to imagine. He was selected for a responsibility, and he accepted, and he put his whole heart into it without fear of failure. He was the catalyst that would produce change. And what he did in that speech is he essentially established the foundations for the civil rights movement over the next decade. And it really focuses on thin paper to thick action of weapons. What weapons would the people on the wrong side of the barricade have? He identified two: the teachings of Jesus and the weapons of protest. He explained in 1858, I believe it was called Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, in an essay he wrote. He explained some of that in that essay. He talked about Mohandas K. Gandhi, a man from India who had challenged the British Empire and essentially won Indian independence. He developed, Gandhi, this method called Satyagraha. Satya is truth which equals love. That's the definition of Satya. Truth which equals love. Graha is force. So Satyagraha, therefore, is truth force, or love force. And King writes the following: prior to reading Gandhi, I had always concluded that the ethics of Jesus were only effective in individual relationships. Turn the other cheek. Love your enemy. This was a philosophy that was only valid when individuals were in conflict with other individuals, or so he felt. But he writes, when racial groups and nations were in conflict, I thought a more realistic approach would be necessary. But after reading Gandhi, I saw how utterly mistaken I was. He later wrote in that same essay, when I went to Montgomery as a pastor, I had not the slightest idea that they had become involved in a crisis in which nonviolent resistance would be applicable. When the protest began, my mind consciously and unconsciously was driven back to the Sermon on the Mount with its sublime teachings of love and the Gandhian method of nonviolent resistance. There you have it. The inspiration of love from Christ. Christ would be the inspiration. Gandhi would be the application, the method, protest. There you have your weapons. The teachings of Jesus, the love of Jesus, the method of protest. But how would this play out? Go back to the barricade. You had to transform the hearts of those on both sides. You had to. A civil war didn't correct it. Guns and bullets couldn't correct it. We'll just build a new wall. You have to transform the hearts. And first, you transform the hearts of the oppressed. I wrote this. I hope it's good. Americans have promised equality, liberty, and justice. But I thought of the people in the audience that night. Even blacks in the South at that time. I did what I asked you to do, I imagine. They had lived day after day behind barricades that kept them from promises. King understood that to turn the promise made on thin paper into the kind of thick action that would destroy a barricade, a mountain, that he had to get inside of them. He had to touch their spirit. He had to tell them that the promise was theirs, that they had a right to claim that promise. He had to tell them to love the promise and not to hate those who took it from them. He had to build courage into a discouraged people so they would have hope and they would have the ability to stand up straight and look right into the eyes of the people who had for their whole lives told them they were inferior. He had to get courage to stand up and look in the eyes of the people who had built the barricades and then told them it was good for you, it's best for you to stay in your place. He had to get them the courage to look into the eyes to those who had all the power and all the weapons and demand that they take down the barricade, that they surrender. That was his charge. That was his instruction in his spirit. But in doing that, he risked provoking anger, hatred. In the middle of the bus boycott, King was out working, and someone bombed his home. His wife, now 2 children, were there. And he rushed home. He didn't know. He didn't know if they were alive or dead. He gets to the home, and he sees the damage, but he sees an angry crowd outside his home. They weren't white. They were black. And they were ready to do damage. But he runs by them into the house to check on his wife and kids, and there's a policeman in there with him. And the wife, Coretta, and the kids are fine. And the policeman is scared because he knows what just happened. Dr. King makes sure everybody's all right. He goes out on his porch and he gives what historians call the Sermon on the Porch. This is what he says, in part, to this angry group outside of home. We believe in law and order. Don't get panicky. Don't do anything panicky at all. Don't get your weapons. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. Remember, that is what God said. We are not advocating violence. We want you to love your enemies. I want you to love our enemies. Be good to them. Love them. And let them know you love them. I definitely would not have been able to do that. The police were relieved. King then encouraged them to finish the boycott, and they did, and saw it to victory. I'm sorry to go on, but I'm almost done. That's step 1. Inspire the oppressed. Step 2. Once you've inspired the oppressed, get them into action. Create tension. King said, I'm not afraid of tension. Tension is necessary to create change. Boycotts, sit-ins, marches, resist law, break law. That will create the tension. Enforce a response, but make sure that you resist and break law both openly, lovingly, with a willingness to accept the consequence. And in so doing, your conscience, which caused you to break the law, will touch their conscience as the weapon of law is just. Now, part 3. Once the conscience of the oppressor has been touched, once the spirit of the oppressor has been touched, you have to work to transform your heart. This is critical. This is critical to do in a republic where our laws reflect our values, where our laws reflect our hearts. We the people who ordain and establish the Constitution, we the people are ultimately responsible for our laws. The maintenance of slavery in society proclaiming liberty is evidence of a diseased heart. We fought a war which changed the law, but the war did nothing to transform the heart. A new law was built. Civil disobedience is predicated on the idea that you transform law by transforming the heart of those who make the law. And how do you do this? With love and the teachings of Christ. This is from a book called Voice of Deliverance. Just a couple short quotes from King. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Another one. We shall match your capacity to inflict suffering by our capacity to endure suffering. We shall meet your physical force with soul force. Do to us what you will, and we shall continue to love you. But be ye assured that we will wear you down by our capacity to suffer. One day we shall win freedom, but not only for ourselves. We shall so appeal to your heart and your conscience that we will win you in the process. And our victory will be a double victory. The civil rights movement was successful because the hearts of the oppressors were first transformed. And then they created attention in a way and with such love that they transformed the heart of us all. But you got to be careful. See if I can get to it. You got to be careful. Because there's always a temptation to say that they were successful because God was on their side. Have you ever said that? I hope, I pray, I think, I want God to be on my side. In this conflict, whatever conflict I have, I hope, I pray that God is on my side. That just can't be. See, God could not be called down on this side of the barricade, which people did, or on this side of the barricade. Lincoln said in his second inaugural, he talked about the irony that both sides prayed to God, the same God. God was going to have it. Because God is not on this side of the barricade. God is not on that side of the barricade. God is above all barricades. So how do you take down the barricade? You don't ask God to align with you. You align with God. You get your spirit in line with His spirit. And let Him work. They were successful because they, the African Americans, the Civil Rights Movement, and the whites and Asians and all groups that joined with them, they were successful because they aligned themselves with God. They aligned their spirit with God's spirit. And from that alignment came fruit, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And the Lord tells us that against such things, there is no such law. Alignment with God in the oppressed. Change the diseased heart of the oppressor. And that was necessary because it was the diseased heart behind the unjust law. Light defeated darkness. Love defeated hate. The barricade was destroyed in a way that war could never do. Think of it. 50 years after the Civil War, we were defining people by fractions, segregating every area of life, using children as evidence of a crime, worship as evidence of race. We were giving preposterous literacy tests that prevented people from voting. That was 50 years after the Civil War. 50 years after Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. 1963, 50 years after Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. We sit as one. There are no fractions. Our children are not fractions. We are black and white, and every shade in between. We are immigrant and native born. We are rich and poor. We are conservative and liberal. We are Americans in an American church that align with a church in India. And they have stories to tell us about oppression. The Civil Rights Movement changed law permanently because it changed hearts permanently. That's why we celebrate Dr. King. The brave people that worked in that Civil Rights Movement. And the people like Len and others who just endured prejudice and taunts. And the brave people on the other side who said, no, that's wrong. And broke the barricade. We celebrate Dr. King and the brave people